I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that is the plain truth of it. I was 42, back in the house where I grew up, sleeping in my father's old room because mine still felt too close to the years when life seemed to line up in straight rows. 3 months earlier, I had signed separation papers at a laminate table in an office that smelled like burned coffee and copier toner. 2 weeks after that, my weekends with my son got temporarily adjusted until schedules could stabilize, which is polite language for nobody answering your texts on Friday night. I had always been a diesel mechanic, the kind who trusted torque specs, thread pitch, and gauges that either held pressure or didn't. I believed in things I could tighten with a wrench. I did not believe in stories people told when the diner coffee got low and their voices got soft. My father's homestead sat above the Blackwater River, 3 acres of wet grass, cedar windbreak, and old fence lines that never stayed fixed for long, because winter always found a way under them. In early spring, the Cascades carried 2 seasons at once, thaw and rain, so the ground never quite decided what it wanted to be. By morning, it was a slick, brown sponge. By afternoon, it was rutted clay. By evening, mist leaned through the trees and turned every porch light into a weak yellow halo. The river had already gone high with snowmelt, pressing hard against its banks, carrying whole limbs and bark strips like matchsticks. At night, I could hear it from the kitchen sink. Some nights it sounded like freight rolling through the dark. Some nights it sounded like somebody tearing cloth, long and slow. I told people I came back to settle the estate, but that was only half of it. The harder half was I had nowhere else I could afford, and nowhere else that didn't remind me of what I had dropped. My ex, Carla, and I had stopped shouting long before we stopped trying. That made it worse. Quiet can feel final in a way yelling never does. On the second Monday after I moved in, she called while I was under Dad's old F25, draining coolant into a cracked pan I kept meaning to replace. I wiped my hands and answered on speaker. "Bo, I need to talk schedules." "Okay." "Caleb's got school project weeks coming up. Saturdays are packed through the month. So I'm not picking him up this weekend." A pause, then softer. "Not this one. When do I see him?" "We'll figure it out." I stared up at rusted cross members and said, "We keep saying that." She didn't argue, she just said, "I know," and the line went flat. After that, I built a routine that felt almost military. Like if I kept moving, maybe I wouldn't have to measure the empty parts. Feed the chickens at 6:30, patch whatever fence the deer had leaned through overnight, check the sump pump, grease the hinges on the barn doors, drive into town for parts if I had enough money for parts, and come home before dark, because the lane washed out in places where the culvert had collapsed years ago. I cooked simple and ate standing up half the time. Chili, eggs, toast, canned peaches. I opened the cabinet one morning and saw 2 coffee mugs set side by side, same as when Dad was alive and we'd both head out before daylight. I used one. I left the other where it sat. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was more like I didn't have the energy to decide what to do with it, and indecision can masquerade as reverence if you squint at it from far enough away. Town was 12 miles of county road and 1 stretch of cracked highway. I'd go to Mallory Auto for belts, filters, sealant, odds and ends, and I'd keep the talk practical because practical felt safe. Denny at the counter knew me from years back and did that careful thing people do when they know your business, but don't want to step on it. "You settling in up there?" he asked one rainy Thursday, ringing up a box of hose clamps and a fuel filter. "Settling's a generous word." He gave me half a smile. "River's up early." I noticed. "You still got that old cattle dog?" "June? Yeah, slower now, but she thinks she runs the place." "She probably does." "That part is measurable," I said, and he laughed once, short and surprised, like I'd handed him proof. I still had a sense of humour tucked somewhere under all the rust. June was 13 and grey around the muzzle, with one torn ear from a long-ago encounter with barbed wire and a way of looking at me that made me feel both supervised and forgiven. She followed me through every chore, leaned against my leg when I stood too long staring at nothing, and slept by the back door, even though I left it open enough for her to move around. Animals don't ask for explanations. They register pattern, tone, and whether your hands are steady. Mine were steady with tools and unreliable with people. That bothered me more than I admitted. I could rebuild an injector pump and have it humming by lunch, but I couldn't figure out how to have one conversation with my own kid that didn't sound like a weather report. Caleb liked fishing and drawing trucks with monster tires and asking why gears had to be cut at angles. I knew all the answers for gears. I had run out of answers for the rest. A week into April, rain sat over us like a second sky. I'd wake to it on the metal roof, work through it, drive through it, and lie awake listening to it travel from cedar to cedar in the dark. One evening I stood at the sink with my hands braced on chipped enamel and watched water bead down the outside of the window. I could see my own reflection faint in the glass, shoulders rounded, jaw set. A man trying to look occupied by nothing at all. I remember thinking in the present tense like my mind had collapsed into a single narrow lane. I get up, I fix what is broken, I keep my mouth shut, I make it tonight. I do not ask for more than that, because more than that has already gone. I had built my life around what could be diagnosed and corrected, and still here I was with the central system failing and no manual in sight. Grief is heavy, but uncertainty is the part that wears you down. Grief at least admits what happened. Uncertainty keeps the door open just enough to bruise yourself on it. That was when I started taking dusk walks down to the old logging footbridge, not because I'm sentimental about scenery, but because the river noise drowned out the inventory running in my head. The trail dropped behind the barn, crossed a strip of alder, then opened onto the bank where the bridge reached toward the opposite side in a long, weathered line of planks and steel cable. My grandfather had helped build it with a logging crew decades before county roads were what they are now. It was never elegant, but it held. In spring runoff, it flexed and sighed with every gust. I'd stand there with June at my knee and watch the current muscle past the pilings, carrying foam and bark and the occasional dead branch spinning like a thrown baton. It gave my thoughts something larger to bounce against. I didn't feel better exactly. I felt less cornered. The first evening I stayed past full dark, I checked my phone and saw a message from Carla. Caleb says hi. He got an A on his science quiz. I typed nice work, buddy. Proud of you. Then I deleted proud of you because it sounded like a postcard from a stranger and sent niece job, Cal. Keep at it. He answered an hour later with a thumbs-up emoji and a picture of a model bridge made from popsicle sticks and school glue. I stared at that photo so long, the screen dimmed twice. June nudged my hand until I scratched behind her ears. Yeah, I said to her because she was the only one there to hear it. I know. I tucked the phone away, listened to the Blackwater shove itself through the narrow bend below me, and stayed on the bridge until the cold found its way through my jacket and into my ribs. By the second week of April, those dusk walks had become the one part of the day that felt honest. Work was work, town was town, and the house was a museum of choices I hadn't made in time, but down by the water nothing asked me to explain myself. I could just stand there and be a man in boots on wet planks, breathing cedar and river mud, counting seconds between gusts. Some evenings I muttered out loud, half from habit, half from loneliness. Little checklists about fence staples or brake lines or whether the generator needed a new pull cord. June would sit, patient as weather, watching the trees while I talked to nobody. I didn't know then that those walks were opening a door I had spent years trying to weld shut. At that point, it was simpler than that. I was tired, and I was trying to make it through one more day without dropping something else I couldn't pick back up. I stood there another minute after that, boots damp through at the seams, hand on June's collar while the river kept rolling past like it had somewhere urgent to be. Then I turned us back up the path with my flashlight low, picking around routes I knew by memory, and the dark felt less like nighttime than a room with the furniture moved around. June stayed close enough that her shoulder brushed my calf every few steps. Usually she ranged ahead and circled back. That night, she didn't. Neither did my mind. It kept returning to Caleb's bridge in that photo. The glue squeeze out at every joint, the careful way he had doubled the supports in the middle span, like he already understood that crossings fail where the load gathers. At the house, I toweled June dry on the mudroom mat, fed her half a can of wet food mixed with kibble, then stood at the counter eating cold leftover chili right out of the pot. The sink light buzzed. Rain tapped and dragged across the window. I set my phone down face up and waited for it to light. It did not. I rinsed the spoon, wiped the same clean spot twice with a dish towel, and opened the cabinet just to look at those 2 mugs again. I shut it and went to bed with the radio on low so I wouldn't hear myself thinking. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of the river and had that disorienting second where you don't know which life you're in, the old one or the one you've got now. Then the ceiling in Dad's room came into focus, and that was that. Morning came grey and practical. I repaired a sagging gate by the lower pasture, cut back blackberry canes that had grabbed the fence wire, and pulled an old tarp over the split firewood stack before another rain line moved in. Work always did what it was supposed to do for me. It reduced the world to sequence. Measure, cut, fasten, check. If a bolt rounded off, you drilled it and moved on. By noon, my shoulders burned in a way I trusted. Pain with a reason is easier to carry. But every time I stopped moving, I could feel the familiar drop in my chest, like stepping down one stair in the dark and finding 2. By Thursday of that same week, the Blackwater had climbed another foot against the cottonwood roots below the bridge. I took June down at dusk again. Same trail, same wet smell of alder and churned mud. Same low cloud ceiling turning the whole valley into a dim bowl of light and shadow. The footbridge was slick enough I kept one hand on the cable while I crossed to the center. Planks flexed under my weight and gave that old, dry complaint from decades of weather. I stood there and watched the current shove driftwood sideways through the pilings, then straighten it and take it on. June sat near my left boot, ears loose, breathing slow. That was when the emptiness opened up in me wider than usual. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe nothing did. Maybe it was just accumulation, like water finding the same seam until something gives. I remember staring at the far bank and thinking in present tense again, the way I had at the sink. I show up late to my own life. I answer wrong. I speak when I should listen. I listen when it is already over. I fix engines because engines forgive you if you do the steps in order. People do not. I wanted to call my son and ask him to tell me about his day in small, pointless detail. What pencil he used, who sat by him at lunch, whether his model bridge held pennies before it buckled. I wanted one ordinary conversation that didn't feel negotiated. I stayed quiet instead because silence had become my safest bad habit. June leaned into my leg, heavy and warm. I scratched behind her torn ear and said, "You're doing all the emotional labor around here, you know that?" She sneezed like she disagreed on principle. I laughed once, short and rough in my throat. Yeah, fair point. You mostly supervise and judge. It was one of those dumb little moments that would sound made up if I told it wrong. But it mattered. I was standing over floodwater talking to an old dog like she was my foreman, and somehow that kept me there instead of heading back to the house and closing another door. Wind came down river in a damp push, carrying cold and the sharp mineral smell of fresh-cut banks upstream. A kingfisher rattled once from somewhere near the bend, then went quiet. I watched fog move in strips between the fir trunks on the far side. Not thick enough to hide anything, just enough to soften edges and make distance hard to judge. The world looked worn smooth. I stayed until my fingers stiffened and June began to shiver. Then we crossed back and climbed toward the barn. Halfway up, I turned and looked over my shoulder for no reason I could name. There was only bridge, water, and trees, holding still under rain. The next evening was clearer for an hour before sundown, and the brief break in weather drew every sound out of the woods. Jays argued in the cedars. Chickadees bounced branch to branch like they had somewhere to be. A woodpecker worked an old snag with patient, metered strikes. I walked slower than usual, letting June set the pace. Her hips had started to hitch on steeper ground, so we took the long bend through the alder instead of the straight drop. The mud had a fresh skin over yesterday's tracks, and our boots and paws wrote new ones side by side. At the bridge approach, the woods went silent all at once. Not gradually, not birds moving farther off. One second there were calls and wing noise and the creek chatter under the main current, and the next there was nothing but water and my own breathing. June stopped so fast the leash went taut against my glove. She didn't bristle. She didn't growl. She stood with her head lifted toward the cedar stand on the uphill side, ears forward, tail making one slow sweep, and then holding steady. I felt that old mechanic's reflex kick in, the part of me that starts inventory when something changes. Wind direction steady, no cat scent, no branch crash, no obvious movement. Dog calm, body alert. I told myself it was a cougar passing high and quiet, or maybe a black bear moving through with more manners than usual, and I told myself that because those were known quantities. The problem was June had opinions about both. Cougar meant a low warning rumble and her hackles up. Bear meant annoyed barking and a determined effort to stand between me and trouble, even now with old joints. This was neither. She looked into those cedars with focused attention and no fear, like she was waiting for someone to finish crossing a room. I could feel my pulse in my wrists. I could also feel beneath that something I hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity that wasn't immediately drowned by dread. The silence held maybe 40 seconds, maybe longer. Then a jay let out one sharp complaint from deeper in the timber. A chickadee answered, and the soundscape stitched itself back together as if somebody had lifted a hand. June exhaled and moved on. I followed, trying not to rush, trying not to invent what I could not see. When we stepped onto the first planks, I noticed a wet shine at the center span and thought it was rain pooling in shallow cupping from old boards. It wasn't. 3 smooth river stones sat stacked on the center plank, largest on bottom, then a flatter one, then a small dark one balanced on top like a button. Not random scatter, not tossed, placed. I stopped a few feet away and stared at them long enough for rain to bead on my jacket and run down inside my collar. The stones were clean, almost polished, different color than the gravel on either bank, and dry on their sheltered sides as if they had been set there after the last hard burst of rain. There was no drift line, no debris pattern, nothing to suggest current had done it. Water didn't stack things in the middle of a bridge deck. Kids might, sure, but No boot scuffs marked the wet planks nearby except mine and a faint, older print from a lug sole smaller than mine, likely from days before. I looked into the trees on both sides, suddenly aware of how open I was on that span. Not exposed in a hunted way. Exposed like standing in someone else's workshop after hours, seeing tools laid out in a pattern you don't understand yet. June sat down beside the stones, sniffed once, then looked up at me with that same steady expression she used when waiting for a gate to open. My mouth moved before my pride could stop it. "Excuse me," I said, half under my breath, aimed at the empty cedar shadow uphill. The second the words left me, I felt ridiculous and oddly relieved, like I had acknowledged another presence without having to define it. "If this is somebody's joke," I added quietly, "it's a strange one." No answer came except river and wind through cable. I crouched, held my hand a few inches from the stones, and decided not to touch them. Instead, I stepped around the stack and crossed to the far side with June, then turned back and looked again from a different angle, as if geometry might explain intent. It didn't. The arrangement stayed careful from every side. On the walk home, I kept building explanations and watching them fail in sequence. Kids from town, possible, but they'd leave candy wrappers or boot churn, and they wouldn't pass up carving initials somewhere obvious. A hunter cutting through. Possible, but hunters I knew didn't play at stone balancing in spring mud. One of the old-timers from upriver, maybe, though no one up there walked that bridge after dusk anymore without reason. Each theory covered part of what I'd seen, and none of the whole shape. At the back steps, June paused and glanced over her shoulder toward the trail. Not tense, just attentive. I followed her gaze into the dark line of trees, saw nothing move, and felt the loneliness in me shift 1 degree away from pure weight into something more nuanced, though I didn't have language for it yet. Inside, I hung my wet coat, fed June, and marked tomorrow's fence repairs on the notepad by the fridge. Then I wrote one extra line at the bottom in block letters I could read from across the room. "Check bridge at dusk." I stood there with the marker still in my hand, looking at that line on the notepad like I'd written an instruction for somebody else. June had already settled on her bed by the mudroom door, front paws crossed, eyes half shut but still tracking me. I capped the marker, set it down, and checked the back door latch twice, out of habit I didn't need. Outside, rain softened to a fine hiss on the porch roof. Inside, the fridge motor clicked on and filled the kitchen with that low mechanical hum I usually found comforting. That night, it sounded like company. I tried to sleep and mostly failed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those stones on wet planks, centered, balanced, deliberate. Around 2 in the morning, I got up, drank water straight from the tap, and stood at the sink in the dark so I could hear the river better. The current had a deeper note to it than usual, heavy and crowded, pushing against banks already tired of holding. I told myself I'd check the bridge, confirm some kid had been messing around, and move on with my life like a grown man with adult bills and no room for folklore. Morning came with a hard grey sky and rain that fell steady enough to erase edges. I fed the chickens with my hood up, kicked slop off my boots at the steps, then grabbed fence pliers and a coil of wire to fix a stretch near the Alder Run. June followed but kept close, not in pain, just watchful. The ground along the lower pasture had turned to churned pudding. At the first bend where the trail dropped toward the bridge, I stopped without meaning to. Somebody had cleared the worst of the mud, not with a shovel, not with gravel. Alder saplings that had leaned into the trail after the last blow had been bent aside and tucked under a low forked branch, woven just enough to hold, opening a shoulder-width passage where yesterday you had to step straight into ankle-deep muck. A few flat bark slabs sat in the softest spots like stepping pads. They weren't pretty. They were practical, Whoever did it understood where water pooled and where weight would sink. I crouched and touched one of the bent saplings. Fresh crease in the grain, rain dark but not split. It had taken strength to pull it over that far without breaking it, and patience to set it so it wouldn't spring back. My first thought was county crew, but county crew didn't hike down here in a storm to tidy a private footpath nobody had budget for. My second thought was one of the neighbours. Then I pictured each neighbour I knew. Any of them would have called out from the gate, accepted coffee, and told me what they'd done before I could thank them. I stood there with rain dripping off my hood and felt a quick, unwanted lift in my chest. Not fear, something nearer to being noticed. I moved through the cleared section and finished the fence repair by noon, but my mind kept circling back. I tested every explanation the way I checked a misfire. Fuel, spark, compression, one variable at a time. There had to be a person. People made choices. People stacked stones, bent branches, solved little problems for no clear reason. The part that didn't sit right was the silence around it. No tire tracks at the lane. No footprints I could trust in rain. No half-joking comment in town. Just evidence and absence. By the second week of April, my days had a new hinge in them. I still did the same chores in the same order, but each one carried a second track of attention, the way you can hear a faint bearing whine behind normal engine noise once you know to listen for it. That afternoon I drove into town for feed and a tube of gasket maker, and Denny rang me up while the weather radio by his register muttered about rising water. "You look tired," he said, sliding the feed invoice across the counter. "Been sleeping light. River keeping you up?" River and my own head. I hesitated, then added, "You ever see odd stuff down by old logging paths? Not damage, more like somebody tidied up." He scratched his jaw and gave me a sideways look that wasn't mockery and wasn't belief either. My granddad used to say these hills get looked after in ways people don't always catch. He was full of sayings, though. "That one help with inventory control?" He laughed once. "No, but it helped him live to 87. You be careful down there, Bo. Water's mean this year." "I can measure mean," I said, and lifted the feed bag. Still working on the rest. On the drive home, I felt mildly foolish for asking, but not enough to regret it. Curiosity had slid in beside grief and asked for room, and grief, for once, had to scoot over. Late that evening, after I'd put feed away and changed into dry socks, June went to the back door and stood there with her nose near the seam, not whining, just intent. I opened it. The porch light showed rain hanging in the air like fine wire. Under the eave, where I kept a cracked plastic tote for kindling, sat a neat stack of wrist-thick cedar splits I had not cut. Dry, too. Set back from the drip line with more care than I usually use myself when I was in a hurry. I picked one up and snapped it. Clean, sharp break, pale center, no damp rot. I looked out into the yard and said, "You're either very helpful or very strange." June stepped out beside me, sniffed once toward the dark tree line and wagged her tail in a slow, even rhythm. No tension, no warning. She came back in only when I did. That night, lying awake, I had one of those long internal arguments where both sides sounded like me and neither side won. I know what I know. I know timber, mud, weight, leverage. I know what a human hand does to branches, what pliers do to wire, what weather does to anything left unattended. I also know loneliness can make pattern out of static if you let it. I do not want to be that man, the one who mistakes wish for evidence because he cannot stand the quiet in his own house. But this is evidence. Bent saplings, stacked stones, dry kindling in rain. June calm every time. If this is a person, He moves cleaner than anyone I've worked with, and I've worked with careful men. If this is not a person, then I need a new box for what I'm looking at, because the old boxes don't close anymore. 2 days passed before the rain broke long enough for low fog to settle in bands along the river, instead of falling from the sky. At dawn, the world outside my window looked washed and pale, as if somebody had rubbed charcoal over every edge. I woke before the alarm, pulled on boots, and took June down to the bridge with a thermos in one hand and a flashlight I never switched on. The light was already coming up, thin and blue. The trail held the smell of wet cedar, cold silt, and that faint, clean scent you get after a hard storm finally moves through. Somewhere upstream, a raven called once, then went quiet. June trotted ahead 10 feet, stopped, looked back to check me, and kept going. When we reached the approach, the stones were there again. Same 3, re-stacked on the center plank with the small dark one now turned, so a white vein ran across it like a tiny stripe of paint. I didn't step around them this time. I stopped beside them and crouched. "Morning," I said, not loud. "Appreciate the pathwork." It felt ridiculous and right at the same time. I rested my palm flat on the wet plank, close to the stones but not touching, and waited like I expected an answer I could understand. The bridge shifted under river push. Cable hummed once in the wind. From the far bank came a soft knock of wood against wood as drift caught on the piling and spun free. Then June's posture changed. She didn't bark. Her ears lifted, body angled toward the upstream bend where big boulders broke the current into braided channels. I followed her line of sight, and at first saw only fog, moving water, and black rock shoulders slick with runoff. The fog thinned for half a second, then gathered again, and in that gap, I caught motion that didn't belong to current or branch. Something large stepped from behind a boulder into knee-deep water and paused. The shape was dark and broad, taller by far than any man I knew, with shoulders like a barn door and arms long enough that the hands hung near mid-thigh. It moved with deliberate slowness, placing each foot on submerged stone before shifting weight, like it knew exactly how much force the river could steal. No rush, no display. The kind of controlled movement you see in somebody carrying a sleeping child across uneven ground. I went still down to my fingertips. June stood beside me, tail low and loose, breathing steady. The figure turned slightly toward us. Fog moved across it in layers, revealing and hiding, but I saw enough to fix the scale in my mind against the boulders I'd hauled chain over 100 times. 8 feet, maybe more. Dark fur matted by rain along the forearms. Chest deep, not barrel thick so much as powerful in a working way, like every part had purpose. It lowered its posture as June took one cautious step forward, not cowering, just making itself smaller in the moment, reducing pressure the way good stock dogs do when they approach a skittish calf. I had no place in my practical life for what I was seeing, and still I saw it. My thoughts came fast and blunt. This cannot be right. This is distance distortion. This is 2 things overlapping in fog. This is a man in gear. This is my brain trying to solve loneliness with theatre. Then it lifted its head fully and looked at me, and every theory went quiet for 1 clean second. Its eyes were amber brown in the morning light, steady and unchallenging, set in a face that looked older than any expression I could name. Not human, not animal in the way I'd meant that word all my life. Watchful, patient, aware that I was afraid of being fooled more than I was afraid of being hurt. I don't know how long we held that distance, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 20. Long enough for me to realize my breathing had gone shallow, and to force one slow inhale through my nose. Long enough for June to sit down at my boot without taking her eyes off the figure. Long enough for the river noise to stop sounding like threat and start sounding like context, big and indifferent around a small, precise exchange. The creature shifted back one step, testing footing before committing weight. Then another. It moved into the fir shadow above the boulder line with the same care it had used in the water, never turning its back hard, never jerking, never trying to vanish theatrically. It simply withdrew. Fog closed around the last edge of its shoulder. The bend was empty again. I stayed where I was until my calves shook. When I could move, I crossed halfway down the bank toward the boulders, careful on slick rock. At the waterline, pressed into saturated silt between two stones, was a track too large to argue with. Long heel, broad forefoot, 5-toe impressions softened by seep but unmistakable in proportion. Another lay a yard upstream, partly collapsed where the current had kissed it. I set my boot beside the first and laughed once under my breath, not from humour exactly, more from sheer mismatch. My size 11 looked like a child's print. June sniffed the edge of the track, then lifted her head toward the trees and wagged once. "All right," I whispered, and my voice cracked on the two words. "All right." We climbed back to the bridge and stood by the stacked stones while the fog thinned into ordinary morning. I didn't feel fixed. I didn't feel transformed. I felt rearranged, like a tool chest after somebody else had put every wrench back in a slot I hadn't considered. Grief was still there. The separation papers were still signed. My son was still not in my truck seat on a Saturday morning. None of that vanished. But alongside it now sat a fact I had not asked for and could not dismiss. Something enormous had looked at me without threat, had moved around my old dog with care, and had chosen distance over dominance when distance was offered. On the walk home, June ranged a little farther ahead than she had in weeks, checking the trail like she had work to do again. At the porch steps, I turned and looked back through alder toward the hidden line of river. The house was the same weathered place, paint peeling near the window trim, gutters needing rehang on the north side. The day's chores were still waiting. Yet the morning carried a narrow thread of attention I hadn't felt in months, something between caution and wonder, and it tugged me forward instead of down. June and I came straight home from the Dawn Bridge, both of us wet to the skin, and I stood in the mudroom longer than I needed to with river silt still on my hands from the tracks at the waterline. By the time the rain eased to a mist and the clock slid into afternoon, I'd changed boots, fed June, and forced myself back into routine. I set my lunch pail on the kitchen table and stood there listening to the house settle, one hand still on the handle like I needed permission to move. June drank from her bowl, looked up, and thumped her tail against the floor once, impatient with my pause. That helped. I pulled my wet boots off at the mat, put coffee back on, and went through the motions of an ordinary afternoon. Wiped down the counter, checked the weather radio, wrote fence staples and diesel additive on the notepad, then crossed out diesel additive because money was tighter than the list wanted to admit. Through the back window, the alder tops leaned and lifted in a light wind, and beyond them, the river ran wide and iron grey. The world had not changed shape. I had, just enough to feel it. By late afternoon, I took a socket set and a crescent wrench down toward the footbridge to check the centre bolts I'd been avoiding. June followed at my knee, moving better than she had that morning, like the walk itself had worked some stiffness out of her hips. The trail still showed that careful clearing through the mud, bent alder held in place by tucked branches, bark laid where boots would sink. I stopped and looked at it, with a mechanic's eye instead of a frightened one. Whoever had done this understood leverage. The bends were controlled, not snapped. The bark strips were placed where runoff cut shallow channels, not where they looked neat. Care, not decoration. At the bridge, I knelt by the first truss connection and put a wrench on a nut I knew should have been binding. It turned a quarter turn with almost no resistance. My stomach dropped. I moved to the next. Same. Spring flood had been chewing the structure harder than I'd admitted. I could patch and chain and coax old steel for a while, but I couldn't make it young. The center planks flexed under me when I shifted my weight, and somewhere down in the frame a bolt ticked against metal with each shove of current. I sat back on my heels, rain beginning again in fine mist, and had one of those long, blunt thoughts that felt less like language and more like inventory. I know the numbers. I know force over span. I know wood fatigue and cable age and what water can do in a single bad hour. I know how much repair costs and what's in my checking account. I know the county has bigger roads to worry about and smaller patience for old crossings near one man's land. I know I am tired of pretending I can keep every structure from failing if I just work harder. I know I am standing where my grandfather stood, where my son's little model bridge photo still burns in my pocket memory, and I'm asking for help from a world I decided years ago was deaf. I know this sounds like losing it. I also know the mud was cleared and the kindling was dry and those eyes this morning were steady. If I am wrong in private. If I am right, then I need to stop acting like I'm the only set of hands out here. I stood, wiped rain from my face, and spoke toward the upstream trees before I could edit myself. Bridge is getting loose in the middle, I said. I'll do what I can, just, if you're around, keep clear of the cable. It could whip if a clamp fails. I heard myself and almost laughed at the absurdity of giving safety instructions to a being I couldn't explain, but it felt respectful, and respectful felt better than scared. June sat beside the 3 stacked stones on the center plank and watched the far bank as if waiting for someone she already knew to step into view. Nothing moved for a while except rain and river. I finished tightening what I could, marked 2 bolt heads with a stripe of orange paint from my pocket marker, and turned for home. We had gone maybe 40 yards up the trail when June stopped and looked back. I followed her gaze. Across the span, just inside the cedar line, the dark figure stood in open view. He was farther back than a bow shot, half lit through rain, shoulders massive and still. No crouching, no attempt to vanish. He let me see him. I did what my body wanted first, froze, breath high, muscles tight, then made myself lower the wrench to my side and open my hands. June's tail moved in that same slow, single sweep. The figure tilted his head once, almost curious, then took 1 step closer to the bridge approach, and stopped again. The distance stayed respectful, like 2 men talking from opposite fences. "Evening," I said, voice rough from not using it enough. He didn't answer with sound, he answered by remaining calm. I realized then the oddest part of it all was not that I wasn't being threatened, it was that he didn't seem afraid of me either. Most wild things measure you for danger or nuisance and decide quick. Deer bolt, coyotes angle off, bears test the air and pick terms. This was different. He watched me the way a good hand watches a skittish horse, aware of what could go wrong, patient about what might go right. I took 1 slow step backward up the trail so I wouldn't crowd the moment. He shifted his weight, not advancing, simply holding ground with an ease that made his size feel less like power and more like fact, like a mountain fact. Then, very deliberately, he bent at the waist and set something on the first plank of the bridge near the rail. He straightened, met my eyes for 1 more long second, and retreated into the cedar shadow with 3 quiet steps. No crash, no branch snap spectacle. Rain moved through the space he left. I waited until the trees were still. Then I walked back down with June, knees loose in a way I didn't trust, and found what he had placed. A strip of old chain, rusted but sound, about 4 feet long, with a clevis pin still attached at one end. Salvage from somewhere upstream, useful to a man trying to stabilize a failing span. Not symbolic, practical. I ran it through my hands and felt a laugh rise up, tired and disbelieving and warm all at once. "Right," I said to nobody visible. "You're better at parts sourcing than the store in town." That night, I cleaned the chain at the mudroom sink and set it with my tools like it belonged there. By the next morning, the rain had thickened into a steady downpour, and Blackwater's voice had dropped another note, deeper and more crowded. I spent first light hauling cinder blocks from the shed and setting them by the bridge approach to use as temporary anchors. June stayed under the porch, then wandered down to supervise when I started rigging, her old shoulders wet and stubborn, refusing to be left behind. Midway through, threading the chain through a post eyelet, I heard a different sound under the river noise, the thin, panicked bleat of a young deer. It came from the creek cut just below the trail bend, where runoff from the upper pasture funneled into the main current. I grabbed my fence pliers and slid down the bank, boots skidding in clay. A fawn, last year's size, had one hind leg caught in a wire snare someone had set and forgotten, half buried now in mud and reeds. It wasn't thrashing anymore, just trembling and pulling in short, exhausted jerks that tightened the loop each time. June stood 6 feet away, ears up, not barking. I knelt and reached for the twisted wire. It had cinched into a knot packed with grit. My pliers slipped once, twice. Rain ran off my jacket sleeves into my gloves. The fawn kicked weakly and nearly toppled into the runoff channel, where water had started cutting fast towards the river. "Easy," I muttered, more to myself than to the animal. "Easy, we're almost there." A shadow crossed the bank above me. I looked up, and he was there, close enough now that scale stopped being abstract. He stood just beyond arm's reach on higher ground, rain sheeting off dark fur, chest broad as a pickup hood, eyes fixed not on me, but on the trapped leg. Every part of me went taut, then held. June glanced at him and sat down in the mud like this was a known arrangement. "Okay," I said, throat dry despite the rain. "Okay. Help then." He lowered himself carefully, one knee touching the bank, and extended a hand the size of a shovel blade toward the snare stake, driven in the mud. He paused an inch from it, waiting for me to accept the movement. I nodded once. He gripped the stake and pulled it free in one smooth motion that made no drama of strength, just precision. The wire slackened enough for my pliers to find the twist. I cut, unwound, and slid the loop off the fawn's leg. The deer stumbled up, hesitated as if stunned by its own luck, then bounded 3 awkward leaps into brush and vanished. For a moment I stayed crouched, cut wire in my hand, rain drumming on my hood and on his shoulders. He didn't reach for me, didn't crowd, just watched to make sure I was steady after the scramble. I pushed myself upright slowly. Mud sucked at my boots. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my jaw. "Thank you," I said, and the words came out clean. He turned his head toward June. She stood, walked forward 2 steps and sniffed the air near his wrist. He held still, then eased that great hand down to the ground and laid a small bunch of something beside a root. Early wild violets, stems muddy, petals bruised but bright against the brown bank. A gift, plain as daylight. He withdrew his hand, rose to full height, and backed away up the slope with that same measured care, giving us room. At the top of the bank he looked back once, amber eyes steady in the rain. then disappeared between two cedars without sound. I picked up the violets and the cut length of snare wire and climbed to the trail with June pressed against my leg. Neither of us hurried. Back at the bridge, I tucked the flowers at the rail beside the stacked stones, anchored the new chain he had brought where I needed it most, and tested the tension twice. It held. Not permanent. Enough. By dusk, the county weather radio issued a flood watch upgrade for our stretch, and I wrote the warning time on the fridge notepad under my grocery list. Then I added another line beneath it in block letters. Same as before. Check bridge before first light. I set the cut snare wire in a coffee can labelled scrap. As proof for myself, I hadn't imagined that creek bank. And I pressed one violet between 2 pages of Dad's old equipment manual, so I'd have a record that wasn't only memory. June 8, circled twice and slept hard by the door, paws twitching in a dream that looked more like running than fear. I sat at the table with both hands around a cooling mug and listened to river, rain, and the quiet house. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt shared. I sat there another 10 minutes with my hands around that mug, listening to the rain ratchet up on the roof, then ease, then return heavier, like the sky was testing every setting it had. June slept by the door and twitched now and then, chasing something in a dream. The weather radio clicked and hissed on the counter, and at 9:40 it broke in with a flat county voice about flood stage rise on Blackwater tributaries and possible route impacts by morning. I got up, wrote the updated Rivercrest estimate beside my block letter note, and stared at it until the numbers stopped being abstract. At 10:15 I called County Roads, got transferred twice, then landed with dispatch. The woman on the line sounded tired but sharp. Blackwater Footbridge by the old Fisher place, I said. Centre hardware is loose and the river's pushing hard at the downstream truss. If a heavy vehicle tries that span at first light, I don't trust it. She asked for marker points, nearby roads, structure type, and whether this was private access or public use. I gave her what I had, including the school route shortcut when the lower road flooded. We've got crews stacked already, she said. Earliest visual is mid-morning if water allows. I can flag school transport to hold at the west approach until Rhodes checks in. Please do that. I did, she said. You did the right thing calling. I thanked her, hung up, and did not feel better. I trusted her effort. I did not trust timing. Riverwater never signed the same schedule as county paperwork. By midnight, the power blinked twice, then held. By 1:30, I stopped pretending I would sleep. I laid out chains, 2 ratchet binders, a maul, socket bar, spare clevis pins, and that rusted chain section he had brought me. I filled a thermos, pulled on my rain shell, and clipped June's lead, even though she hated it on home ground. She gave me a look that said she tolerated my flaws the way old dogs do, patient and mildly disappointed, and leaned against my leg while I checked the porch light one last time. By 4 in the morning, rain was coming sideways under a hard wind from upriver. We made the trail by headlamp, mud sucking at every step, alder branches shaking cold water down my collar. The Blackwater sounded wrong before we even reached the span. Not louder exactly, but thicker, like there were boulders rolling inside the current where no boulders should be moving. At the bridge approach, I swept my beam across the centre planks and found the 3 stones on the rail, lined end to end this time, and below them in the saturated bank were fresh tracks too deep and too broad for any story I could explain away. I crouched under the cable and set to work. First chain around the upstream post and through the eye bolt. Binder tightened to bite. Second chain down to anchor rock, where the old concrete footing still held. Spare section joined with the clevis pin he'd left. I tested each run with my full weight and got the ugly answer. Better than before. Still not enough if the river hit it broadside at the wrong moment. The center sway had turned from nuisance to warning. June stood on the approach boards, rain slicking her coat flat, head angled toward the tree line on the east bank. When dawn started lifting, it did it without color, just grey on grey through rain bands. I was on my knees at the downstream truss, wrench on a stubborn nut, when I heard a diesel engine laboring in low gear from the far side road. School bus. Air brakes hissed once, then the engine held. I stood and waved both arms, shouting across water and wind to stop at the approach. The bus stayed put, hazard lights blinking amber through sheets of rain. The driver door opened and I saw Hank Ruddle, who had run routes in this county longer than most deputies had worn badges. He shouted across, words torn by wind. "Lower roads under 2 feet at Mason Cut. Dispatch sent me this way and then told me hold short till inspection. You got inspection?" "I got chain and bad news," I yelled back. "Give me 2 minutes." He nodded and stayed in place, hands on the wheel, engine idling. No one stepped off. No one moved except rain and river, and me trying to make an old crossing keep one more promise. Then the bridge kicked sideways under a shove of debris I never saw hit. The downstream truss dipped, rose, and began to shimmy in a rhythm that could walk a structure to failure if it found its frequency. I dropped the wrench, grabbed the nearest chain run, and leaned my full weight into it. It steadied for a breath, then shuddered again. June barked once, sharp and urgent, toward the upriver bank. He came out of cedar and rain like he had been there all night. He moved straight into the flood at the downstream side, chest deep in black water, feet finding purchase where I would have been swept in 3 steps. No roar, no display, no wild flailing. He set himself beneath the truss beam with both arms braced, one forearm under steel, one hand spread against timber, and lowered his center of gravity the way a trained rigger takes load. The bridge settled. Not perfectly. Enough. I stopped breathing for a second and then yelled to Hank, "Now! Crawl it! Straight line, no brake spikes. Keep it centered." Hank leaned out his window, eyes locked on me, then looked once toward the figure in the water and made the sign of the cross against his chest without drama. He put it in gear. The bus rolled onto the planks at a pace slower than walking, engine barely above idle. I ran beside the near rail through rain, one hand on the cable, shouting small corrections over wind. "Easy, hold that. 2 feet left." "Good. Keep coming." Inside my own head, something broke open that I had locked down for years with work and routine and measured answers. I remember the words because they arrived in a rush, present tense, blunt as a confession. I cannot hold this alone. I have not held it alone for a long time. I thought losing my marriage and losing Saturdays with my boy and losing my father meant the world had gone cold and final. I thought kindness had to be negotiated, scheduled, signed, then cancelled. But here is strength in floodwater using itself for protection, not ownership. And here is a bridge that should have gone and did not go. And here is my old dog calm in the middle of it. And here am I with rain in my eyes and no room left for pride. I am not being mocked. I am being helped. I am being helped. The bus reached midspan. The truss jolted once as a log scraped past the submerged brace. He adjusted, tiny shift in his shoulders, hands never slipping. Every movement controlled and careful around weight that could have crushed a man if handled wrong. I had seen big engines lifted by cranes with less precision. I had never seen anything that large move with that kind of gentleness under strain. "Almost there!" I shouted. Hank kept rolling. Tires found the far approach gravel. The rear end lifted off the last plank, and the whole bus settled onto solid ground. He drove 30 yards clear, stopped, and leaned out again, rain running off his cap. "You good over there?" "Yeah," I yelled back, voice shaking. "Get up to High Road and log it with dispatch." He looked once more toward the river, then back at me. Whatever helped us, it meant to. I nodded because I couldn't answer yet. My throat had closed up. As soon as bus weight came off, I cinched the final binder and hammered the pin home with numb hands. The chain bit. The bridge held its line. I turned toward the flood and found him still braced, waiting until the load path was secure. When I gave a single thumbs up, feeling foolish and formal and deeply sincere all at once, he eased pressure off the truss in stages, not all at once, letting the structure take itself back slowly. Then he stepped backward through the current, each foot testing bottom before commitment, water sheeting off dark fur and broad shoulders. I stood in open rain and cried harder than I had at my father's funeral. No hiding it, no swallowing it back. June pressed against my knee and stayed there while I let it happen. There was relief in it, yes, but also recognition, like finding one true bearing mark after driving in fog too long. I laughed once through it, because the moment was so far beyond anything I would have believed that month. I was soaked to the bone, hugging a cable on a failing bridge, and nodding thanks to a 9-foot stranger in a river like we were finishing a fence job together. He reached the opposite bank, climbed the mud slope, and paused by the rail where the stones had sat all week. He set one large hand on the top plank for balance, then turned back toward me in full morning light. Amber-brown eyes, steady as ever. No demand in them, no claim. Just that same patient awareness I had seen at dawn by the boulders, and again by the snared fawn, as if he was checking one last time that we were all right. At the rail near where he stood, a small clump of wild violet lay flattened by rain, petals dark against wet wood. He looked at June. June wagged once, slow and certain. Then he dipped his head, almost like acknowledgement between men who had done necessary work, and walked into the cedar line. 3 steps, then 6, then only shadow between trunks and mist. No theatrics, no lingering silhouette. The woods took him back the same quiet way they had offered him, and the river kept running as if this had been one more morning in a long, old valley. I stayed on the bridge until my breathing settled and my hands quit shaking. Then I picked up the dropped wrench, checked each chain point again, and keyed my phone with stiff fingers to call dispatch back. "This is Beau Fisher at Blackwater Footbridge," I said when they answered. "Emergency crossing is complete. Bus is through. Structure is temporarily stabilized with chain and binders, but it needs full closure and crew attention now." "We've got your update from the driver," the dispatcher said. "Crew is en route as soon as water lets them stage." "Copy that." I ended the call, slid the phone into my pocket, and touched the wet top rail where the violet rested. June leaned into me, warm despite the rain, and together we walked home through alder and mud while the storm finally began to spend itself. By the time June and I reached the porch, rain had thinned to a cold mist that hung in the yard like breath. I stripped my jacket in the mudroom, toweled her down, and set a dry blanket by the door. My hands were still shaking when I rinsed river grit from my knuckles at the sink. I could see the cut snare wire in the scrap can on the shelf, the rusted chain links drying on old newspaper, and Dad's equipment manual on the counter with one page puffed slightly where a pressed violet sat between diagrams for a hydraulic pump. All of it was real, all of it ordinary, and none of it fit the life I had been living a month earlier. At 8:12 that morning, dispatch called back while I was pouring kibble. "Mr. Fisher, County Roads has closed the footbridge to all traffic effective now," the same tired, sharp voice told me. "Crew staged at West Approach. School transport rerouted to High Road. No injuries reported from the crossing." I sat down at the table because my knees said to. Thank you. We also have a deputy coming to take your statement with the drivers. You still on site? I am. A pause, softer this time. You sounded pretty calm on that second call. You did good work out there. I looked at June, already eating, tail tapping once against the cabinet. It wasn't just me. She let that sit, then said, Deputy will be there inside the hour. By mid-morning, the clouds lifted enough to show torn blue above the cedar tops. Deputy Lyle Mercer pulled in with mud to his wheel wells, stepped out, and stood a second looking toward the river before he came to the porch. He was a practical man, late 50s, narrow shoulders, neat moustache, the kind who listened with his whole face and didn't waste words. Bo, he said, Hank's statement matches your timeline. I need yours, official. We sat at my kitchen table. I gave him the sequence exactly. Dispatch hold request, chain placements, truss movement, bus approach, stabilization, clearance call. Then I told him what held the downstream side steady while the bus crossed. I did not soften it, and I did not dress it up. Lyle's pen slowed once, then continued. When I finished, he capped his pen and looked at the window for a long beat. You understand I can log structural assistance by unidentified party, he said carefully, and I can log your observed description as witness account. That's fine, he nodded. Show me what you've got physical. I brought him the cut snare wire from the coffee can, explained where and when the fawn was freed, and he tagged it for animal control follow-up. I showed him the chain segment with the worn clivis pin that had not come from my shed inventory. He photographed it on my workbench, then photographed my chain runs and binder placements at the bridge from multiple angles. I told him about the stacked stones, the path clearing, the kindling under the eave, and the prints at the bank. By then, rain and runoff had softened most tracks beyond clean measurement. Lyle took photos anyway. At the door he stopped, hat in both hands. My grandmother used to leave apples on a stump up by Dry Creek, he said, not looking at me. Said the hills weren't empty just because we were loud. I never saw anything myself. He put his hat on. I also never mocked her for it. Then he gave June a scratch behind the ear and left. That afternoon, Hank Ruddle came by in his route jacket, carrying a dented thermos and a face I'd seen only in passing for years. We stood on my porch looking at the river flatten out under a weak strip of sun. I keep replaying the center span in my head, he said. I had 9 kids staring through fogged glass, and that bus felt like a tin can on chop. You drove it clean, I said. He shook his head. I drove what I was given. Something gave us a chance first. He handed me the thermos. Coffee, my wife insisted. We drank in silence a while. Before he left, he said the line again, slower, like he wanted it set in wood grain. Whatever helped us, it meant to. That was the only version either of us ever needed. 3 days later, county roads brought in barricades, then engineers. I stood with Foreman Rita Calder at the approach while she studied my temporary rigging and the warped center section. You bought us time, she said. Not much. Enough. Can it be saved? She looked at the span, then at the river. Not responsibly, she tapped her clipboard. We're recommending full replacement. Steel truss, higher deck, proper abutments. I should have felt loss hearing that. Mostly, I felt relief. The old bridge had carried generations, and it had done its last hard day. I watched crew members remove my chains with careful hands and stack them by my toolbox. I kept the rusted chain section separate and hung it on a nail above my bench, where I could see it whenever I reached for a wrench. On Thursday, I drove into town for parts I didn't urgently need, mostly to stand under fluorescent lights and hear ordinary voices. Denny rang up a fuel filter and tube grease, then leaned on the counter. Heard about the crossing, he said. Heard you kept a bus from going in. Bridge held, I answered. He studied me with that same sideways look from weeks back, only this time there was no caution in it. Grandad used to say kindness in the woods doesn't announce itself because it isn't looking for credit. I gave a tired smile. That sounds like him. Mm-hmm. He slid the receipt over. You sleeping any better? Some. Good. You look more here. That phrase stayed with me all the way home. More here. The following Saturday, Carla pulled into my driveway at 6:55 with Caleb in the passenger seat and a tackle box on his lap. I had not seen him in person in too long, and for 1 second I nearly fumbled the simple act of opening my own front door. He climbed out taller than I remembered, hair needing a cut, same quick eyes. Hey, Dad. Hey, Cal. Carla stayed by the truck while he grabbed his hoodie. Back by 6? She asked. Back by 6, I said. She looked from me to the river line beyond the barn. He's been talking about fishing all week. Then quieter. Thank you for keeping your word. I'm trying. She nodded once and drove off. Caleb and I spent the morning at a slower bend upstream where the bank shelved easy. We talked about bait, current seams, and why trout hold where oxygen rolls under overhangs. We caught 2 small rainbows and let both go. Around noon, while we ate sandwiches on a log, he looked toward the old bridge corridor and said, Kids at school said your bridge almost washed out and Mr. Ruddle said you fixed it. I helped, I said. He frowned slightly. He said that weird, like there was more. There was the crux in plain terms. Tell him everything, and risk asking him to carry what adults barely could, or tell him nothing, and teach him silence where honesty belonged. I took a breath. The river was bad, I said. I called it in, I chained what I could, and something else out there helped hold long enough for the bus to cross. He studied my face like he was checking for a joke. A person? I don't know what word fits best. I met his eyes. I know it wasn't trying to scare anyone. I know it protected kids. Start there. Caleb sat with that for a while, then nodded in a way that looked older than 12. Okay. He kicked at pebbles. Can we still build a stone stack before we go? Yeah, I said, voice catching a little. We can. We built 3 small cairns on the bank, each one deliberate, large flat stone, smaller cap, dark smooth top. June lay beside us in the sun, supervising as always, as Caleb balanced the last stone, leaned back on his hands, and grinned. Looks right. It does. By the second week of June, the county posted the replacement plan at the Grange Hall. Steel pedestrian service span, elevated deck, flood-rated anchors. At the bottom of the printout, under project notes, I saw the name and read it twice to be sure. Fisher Footbridge. I stood there with Rita Calder and 2 neighbours while people drifted past with coffee cups and wet jackets. You didn't ask for that, did you? Rita said. No, she smiled. Sometimes communities decide faster than committees. The new bridge opened in early fall under clear sky and cottonwood leaves just starting to turn. No speeches, just a ribbon cut by the school principal, Hank parked nearby with a quieter bus, and kids crossing in pairs while parents pretended not to cry. I walked the span at dusk after everyone left. Steel under boots, no sway, river wide below, and manageable for once. At centre, on the right rail, someone had set 3 smooth stones in a careful stack. No one nearby. No footprints that meant anything by then. I did not touch them. I still kept the pressed violet in Dad's manual. I still kept the rusted chain on the shop wall. Animal Control closed the snare report as illegal set, removed, no active line found. And Deputy Mercer mailed me a copy for my records with a sticky note that read, plain language, full file, same as told. Dispatch never called me dramatic, never called me mistaken. They logged what happened and moved routes before daylight the next storm cycle. Denny never pressed for details again. He only asked once a month, "You more here?" And I kept being able to answer yes. I never saw him that close again. Once, late in October, June and I found kindling stacked under the eave after a 2-day rain. And once we found Alder bent off the trail after windfall. We also had many evenings with nothing unusual at all, only river and birds and my own breathing finding a steadier rhythm. Not every gesture asks to be repeated. Some are complete the first time. What changed was not that I quit being practical. I still trusted torque specs, weather radio, and tape measures. I still labelled bins in the shop and balanced accounts to the dollar. The shift was deeper and harder to explain. My framework for what counted as real got bigger without getting sloppy. Evidence still mattered. So did humility. I had seen strength used as shelter by a being that wanted no credit, and that fact kept working on me like clear water over stone. On Saturdays, Caleb and I kept fishing. Before heading home, we nearly always stopped by the riverbank and stacked 3 stones on a dry patch above the floodline. Sometimes they stood all week. Sometimes wind or raccoon or careless boots knocked them flat by morning. We rebuilt them anyway. He got older, talked more, then less, then more again the way boys do. I learned to listen longer before answering. I quit deleting the words "proud of you." If you ask me now what I carry from that spring, it is this: the world is wider than my old measurements, and kindness is not a soft thing. It is load-bearing. It can brace against current, hold steady under strain, and step back without needing to be seen. I had spent years believing I was alone with my failures on a failing bridge. I was wrong. I am grateful for that. Every day I still get to cross.